this year's grant opportunities. The Foundation for Physical Therapy Research will offer up to $500,000 in physical therapy research grants this year. After our upcoming panel, we will discuss these opportunities as well as our new grants management platform, Proposal Central. The Foundation funds physical therapy research grants, scholarships, and fellowships. Since 1979, we've funded more than $20 million in research. Our rigorous review process is modeled after the National Institutes of Health and helps emerging researchers secure early career funding and funding application experience that better prepares them to apply for additional funding. You will hear us refer to as follow-on funding. Our researchers, including our two speakers for today, have built on FPTR funding to secure additional funds from larger agencies like the NIH, the Department of Defense, the National Institute of Arthritis and Musculoskeletal and Skin Diseases, among others. On that note, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Stacey Dusing is a 3-time Foundation funding recipient, also having received a 2013 pediatric research grant, a PODS 2 scholarship, and a Macmillan doctoral scholarship. Her work most recently culminated in a $2.84 million NIH grant titled The Evaluation of the Efficacy of a Physical Therapy Intervention Targeting Sitting and Reaching for Young Children with Cerebral Palsy. She's a board-certified clinical specialist in pediatric physical therapy and the director of the Motor Development Lab at the University of Southern California's Division of Biokinesiology and Physical Therapy. Stacey also is a volunteer with the Foundation, both on our Awareness Committee and as a member of our Scientific Review Committee, participating in our peer review process. Stacey, thank you for being here today. Would you like to tell us about your research and Foundation funding?
Thank you so much, Liz, for the opportunity to be here. I'm thrilled to get to share the opportunities that I've had to advance my research career, in large part related to the Foundation's funding. As Liz mentioned, I'm a board-certified pediatric physical therapist, and as such, my research really is in the sphere of pediatrics. I'm very interested in the early detection of disabilities in children who are at high risk for disabilities, primarily cerebral palsy, as a result of preterm birth or early brain injury. I had the great fortune as a PhD student of attending the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I have a bachelor's in physical therapy, and so I started off in a master's program. While in my master's program at Chapel Hill, I got my first experience in trying to get funding, but in a very small way, seeking out funding from the community. Following that, I was able to secure funding from the National Institute of Health, as well as the Foundation for Physical Therapy, through small organizations and small grants. The Foundation funding that I got early on, as was mentioned, was the Macmillan, which is similar to a PODS 1 at this time. Let's see, and those are Dr. Smith's slides. If we can switch over to the other slide deck, that would be great. Perfect. I also was very fortunate that I had funding from HRSA, or through the Maternal and Child Health Bureau, through the Leadership Education and Neurodevelopmental Disabilities. And as you see highlighted in these slides, there are additional funding sources out there. I worked almost 20 hours a week as a therapist while I was doing my PhD. And a large piece of that was really the decision to say, how do you get funding? My mentor didn't have funding to cover my entire tuition at the time. So I had funding through scholarships. And as the funding increased from scholarships, like the Foundation, I was able to reduce the amount of time I worked. Transitioning into faculty life, in the next slide, you'll see the real transition and the ups and downs of funding. And so again, I had the opportunity while I was on faculty at Virginia Commonwealth University, I applied for and was accepted into the CORT program, or the Comprehensive Opportunities in Rehabilitation Research Training Program, funded by the National Institute of Health. That followed after having some small funding from NIH from the equivalent of a clinical and translational research center. I had small funding, again, through groups within my organization and within the university, and then followed that with the pediatric research grant from the Foundation for Physical Therapy. The interesting thing when I look at this trajectory is everything follows in line with my previous funding. So I have 2 NIH R01s at this time. both of which are directly linked from those previous funding opportunities I had from the foundation. One that stemmed from the work I did with preterm infants that's now led to my first R01 and now the renewal application, which is under review. And then a second set of foundation funding that led to the current grant looking at children with cerebral palsy. And really, it's building that foundation funding over time that's allowed me to be successful.
Thank you, Stacey. Next, we have a brief presentation from Beth Smith. Beth Smith is a 2016 Foundation Pediatric Research Grant recipient and a 2011 NIFTY recipient. She was recently named one of the principal investigators on a groundbreaking nationwide consortium, the Healthy Brain and Child Development Study. Through a $6.8 million 5-year grant from the National Institutes of Health, the Healthy Brain and Child Development Study will provide a comprehensive picture of healthy brain development in children. Smith will capture how motor, cognitive, and social development interact in infants as infants learn and grow through the use of wearable sensors.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here today, and the foundation was absolutely instrumental in early funding and allowing me to start down this road of funding, and I am grateful for that to this day. Hopefully you can get some insight today on what that path looks like, and then we have some questions and answers later. So I direct the Infant Neuromotor Control Laboratory, and my lab is located at Children's Hospital Los Angeles. So in my lab, we are focused on movement, both as an input to the developing central nervous system and as an output of the developing central nervous system. So we use a number of technologies to measure infant movement and behavior in very quantitative ways. So we use wearable sensors, which was mentioned as part of the HBCD project. We use electroencephalography, head-mounted eye tracking, smartphones sometimes. So we're measuring movement in very quantitative ways and measuring movement as an input to the developing central nervous system. So how much practice, what type of practice is necessary for infants to learn to reach, to crawl, to move, and movement as an output of developing central nervous system. And there the focus is on early identification so that we can provide early intervention. So in terms of funding, I do have a couple of slides similar to Dr. Dusing's that show some of my grant funding progression. So the very first grant that I got was, as a PhD student, it was actually $75, and it supported some parking cost for participants coming in for research studies. So that was it. You know, I just want to make a point that we start small and build on that. I had foundation funding from some kind of local and regional foundations, and as a postdoc then had funding from the foundation and also from the NIH as an F32. So those were both, the NIFTY and the F32 were both training career development awards. And then you notice the funding from the Academy of Pediatric Physical Therapy. That was a smaller grant, and that was a new idea that I was developing. The F32 and the NIFTY, those grants, I have the relative total cost along the y-axis. So those were relatively larger grants that had built on the earlier ones. And then the pediatric physical therapy grant was a small one, again, developing a new idea. So if you move forward to the next slide, you can see my funding progression as a faculty member. And I do want to point out the one of the grants from the Academy of Pediatric Physical Therapy was a planning grant, and that was instrumental in one of the R01s that was funded quite a few years later. And that fits into the conversation about the amount of time it takes to develop research projects from ideas into large funded projects. So again, you'll notice a number of foundations, and then starting to get more into federal National Science Foundation, and then a number of NIH grants. And that's where I am today. So thank you very much. And I'm happy to answer questions as we move into the next portion.
Thank you, Beth. We have a few questions for both of you from some of our event registrants. Beth, first, what is the most frustrating part of applying for follow-on funding, and how do you overcome that initial road bump?
Sure. So I would say the most frustrating part is how long it takes. So writing and then submitting a high quality application, waiting, getting reviewed, revising and responding to the reviews, waiting some more, sometimes revising again, waiting for decisions. It's usually a couple of years from the idea to funding. So that is, that can be pretty frustrating because you are trying to do the research and move your career forward, and it just takes a long time. And the key, I think, to overcoming that is perseverance. You just have to know that it's going to take a long time and keep at it and keep going.
Thank you. Stacey, what do you wish you knew when you were first starting in research and looking for funding?
I think one of the first things is really both that it's going to take a long time, as Beth mentioned, but also the idea of how to communicate with my supervisors and my collaborators and colleagues, that process takes time and that you need support along the way, and figuring out how to set yourself up to be successful. And I don't necessarily think that I knew enough about the benefits of these small projects in looking at that. So it took me a couple years to really feel like, okay, I can see this small grant might lead to a future grant in the future. And so I think those pieces of information are important both for applicants, but also for those who supervise and mentor them.
Thank you. This is for either one of you. We want to talk about research collaborations and wonder what considerations you need to have when you're looking to collaborate and work together on research projects.
I feel really fortunate that I've had great collaborators across my career and continue to. Some of my collaborators have become my closest friends. And I think one of the big things when you're talking with collaborators is always being transparent about what everyone's role will be and keeping those open lines of communication. And if you can't have those open conversations, it's probably not a good collaborative relationship. And I think that starts off when you're mentoring and you're working with a mentor and you practice those conversations with your mentor. And then you transition into a collaborative role after that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I would just, to provide a little bit more maybe structure to that answer, I would say, aligning and agreeing beforehand. So specifically agreeing to the goals and outcomes of the project. What are the outputs going to be? Specific tasks and timelines, who's responsible for what, and then making sure both collaborators have the resources to meet all of the goals and timelines. You're setting yourself up for success when you figure all of that out ahead of time.
Kind of working backward from the goal, huh? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Another one of our questions is, it's a big jump from scholarship funding to your first major funding. What do investigators need to know to work toward independence? Stacey?
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting things to think about is really when you're focusing on scholarships, at what point can you start to make the transition to funding your research, right? Scholarship funding tends to fund your time and your tuition or the pieces of things that in grad school, nothing else can fund, but it doesn't tend to fund your actual research. But then you start to have this overlap of, now I can start applying for small grants to actually pay stipends to my participants, or parking, or for equipment as you're gradually working through things. Before you get to the point where you can fund your entire salary or fund a large portion of your salary. So I think working through that process of, you eventually have to move from funding your tuition to funding your salary, and knowing that funding the research dollars to do an actual scientific project in the interim is important. And so eventually you're working on a parallel structure of those two things together. And I think that's a big place for people to know, I have to focus on that as an interim before I'm going to get to these big dollar amounts.
Yeah, I think it's really important to know where you're trying to go and to be able to say, okay, here's the big project I want to do, but I can identify that there's these 4 or 5 preliminary pieces of information that I need first. I need to be able to show A, B, and C. I need to have, power calculations or show efficacy or whatever it might be. Being able to identify those smaller pieces that can be done with some smaller grants in a year or two, and being able to see the whole structure laid out, I think is, you need to do that before you can be successful.
Advice for emerging investigators. Kind of building on that answer, Beth.
Yeah, so I really will go back and say again that perseverance is key. I see it as a balance between constant motivation and determination and patience. You have to be constantly working toward goals that are often a long way off, while simultaneously being patient with how long it is taking to get there, if that makes sense. The other thing I would say is that mentorship is absolutely key. You can't just read the NIH application guide and then know how to write a grant. There's so much to it. So you need to find mentors with the experience and the commitment to mentor you. Stacey?
I couldn't agree more. Absolutely. I think mentoring for me was one of the biggest pieces of that. And if your mentor doesn't fully believe in you, then it's not the right mentor for you. You need to have somebody who's going to help support you, but also who's going to say, keep going, keep trying. And when you fail or you don't get the first grant, that's going to help pick you up and say, but you can do this and you can keep working towards it. Because we all get a review that feels really bad to get. So making sure that you have somebody around you who can support you through that process is really crucial.
Well, that's for sure. Thinking everything, right? So we have a few more questions, a little bit of extra time. Stacey, we wanted to ask you about if you felt like you've seen changes in the availability for funding for physical therapist researchers specifically.
Yeah, I do think that things are starting to change. Over the course of my career, when I first started looking at NIH grants and talking to NIH about funding shortly after finishing my PhD, it really was unusual for physical therapists to be the lead or the PI on a grant without having a physician counterpart as the lead with them or, really leading the whole project. And I think we have more and more researchers who have adequate training to lead projects. And then we also have larger amounts of money that are being funded from things like the foundation, as well as within the academies of the APTA that are really helping as building blocks to demonstrate the commitment of our profession to supporting research, which really translates into NIH trusting that we can do this work.
Well, that's good. Beth, I have a question for you about what's your most important takeaway for follow-on funding in applying for follow-on funding?
Well, the most important takeaway would be that you have to be applying. And again, we talked about how long it takes to write a quality application. You need mentorship, you need to know the pieces. When most funding agencies have deadlines yearly or, NIH 3 times a year, I've seen a lot of people fall into the trap of next time, and keep, pushing things off. You want to absolutely put in a high quality grant that's going to reflect well upon you, your institution, your ability to do the work, but you also need to be submitting things and not putting them off and waiting. So that's my biggest tip, is that you need to be getting the applications in, high quality applications.
Thank you. I think that's all we have for questions here. And we wanted to start kind of giving you a sneak peek or a tour of our grants now that are open. We'll provide an overview of some of the opportunities in our grants process. However, for full grant guidelines and instructions, be sure to visit our website at foundationforpt.org. Next slide. Our available $40,000 grants for 2022 are the Acute Care Research Grant, the Education Research Grant, the Foundation Research Grant, and the Geriatric Research Grant. Our grants are made possible through our supporters, APTA Acute Care, the APTA Academy of Education, APTA, and APTA Geriatrics. We will also offer the Snyder Research Grant, which is named in honor of Jane Snyder. Slide 3. Our $100,000 grants for this funding cycle are the Magistro Family Foundation Research Grant, the Paris-Patla Physical Therapy Research Grant, and the Paris-Patla Manual Therapy Physical Therapy Research Grant. Please note, all of these grants require a letter of intent or an LOI. We will have future grant opportunities that are available after the 2022 cycle. These include the Pediatric Research Grant, the Academy of Orthopedic Physical Therapy Research Grant, the Pelvic Health Research Grant. We will also offer the Dusinger Family Research Grant and the Marilyn Moffitt Research Grant in the future. Please visit foundationforpt.org for detailed information and instructions related to our 2022 grants. When you utilize the toggles, you are provided with links to the guidelines related to the grant mechanism, which provides information on eligibility, grant amount, use of funds, areas of study, and priorities specific to the mechanism, and the instructions for grant submission through our new platform located at proposalcentral.com. We've switched to a new grants management platform, and the instructions provided above will walk you through the application submission process. We're here to answer questions that arise. Create a login following the instructions provided. After logging on, navigate to the Grant Opportunities page tab and type physical therapy into the search box, and our available opportunities will be listed. Details regarding letter of intent submission deadlines and proposal deadlines are provided for each mechanism. Be sure to note these dates. The LOIs for the Magistro Family Foundation, the Paris-Patla Physical Therapy, and Paris-Patla Manual Therapy research grants are all due on June 1st, with full application submission deadlines of August 5th, 2022 for all of our grant applications. Click the Apply Now button next to the mechanism of your choice to get started. Type in a project title and click Save to open the full application. The project title can be revised at any time prior to clicking the final Submit button. We're prepared to support you through this process. Be sure to start early due to signatures and institutional requirements that can take time and delay your letter of intent and application submission processes. We highly recommend beginning the application process as early as possible so that everyone has time to respond to requests for support, assistance, and provide institutional sign-off where required in a reasonable manner. Please note key dates for our grant cycle, and this is all available at the foundationforphysicaltherapy.org. June 1st, LOIs are due. August 5th is the deadline for full grant applications. Next slide. This slide highlights the administrative process grant submissions and considerations undergo before the foundation settles on the awards they make. As you can see, it is a detailed process that requires many hands to ensure we fund the best PT research applications submitted to us. Our board of trustees and peer reviewers want to select the most promising research And this process also provides valuable feedback to our applicants. Finally, I'd like to highlight our available resources. Of course, grant guidelines and instructions are located at foundationforpt.org. We also can provide sample applications of past successful applicants. Contact us at info@foundationforpt.org or through our website to access these. We also have FPTR staff support if you're having trouble finding answers to your questions. And we also have other webinars and past events archived at the foundationforpt.org that address issues such as resiliency in research and mentorship. In closing, we'd like to thank Stacey Dusing and Beth Smith for their time and expertise today. Our work would not be possible without volunteer support. We wish them the best in their research projects as well. And thanks as well to all our attendees today. We're glad you could join us.